Imagine standing at the southern tip of Florida in 1819. But it's not American soil. Instead, it's Spanish territory, with the red and gold flag of Spain waving above. Fast forward just 2 years, and this very spot is part of the United States. How did this happen so quickly? In this video, we'll dive into the compelling story behind Spain's surprising decision to cede Florida to the United States, basically for free. Let's begin by setting the stage in the early 19th century. The United States, still in its formative years, was beginning to assert itself and explore opportunities for terrestrial expansion. Meanwhile, Spain, once a global superpower, is struggling to hold on to its vast empire as it faces rebellions in its American colonies. Florida, at this time, was a Spanish territory, but it wasn't exactly the tourist paradise we know today. Instead, it was a sparsely populated wilderness, home to Seminole native Indians, runaway slaves, and a handful of Spanish settlers. For Spain, Florida was becoming more of a headache than an asset. Now, you might wonder, why was Florida such a big deal for the United States? Well, for starters, it was prime real estate. Owning a piece of land that controls access to the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, that's strategic gold right there. Plus, Florida was causing all sorts of problems for its American neighbors. Florida had become a haven for Seminole warriors who would raid American settlements in Georgia. It was also a refuge for escaped slaves from the southern United States. And let's not forget about the British, who were all too happy to use Florida as a base to stir up trouble for the Americans. All of this was giving the United States government a massive migraine. They wanted Florida, and they wanted it bad. But how could they get it without starting a war? The United States also had some financial bones to pick with Spain. American merchants demanded compensation for ships seized by French privateers and condemned to Spanish ports during the 1790s. Then there was the matter of American goods that got stuck in New Orleans in 1802 when Spain closed the port to American trade. For Spain, the situation was looking pretty grim. They were fighting a losing battle against independence movements in their American colonies. The last thing they needed was a war with the United States. Plus, Florida was becoming more of a liability than an asset. It was expensive to defend, hard to control, and constantly causing problems with the neighboring United States. As for the United States, they were still recovering from the War of 1812 with Britain. Another war so soon was not an appealing prospect. Besides, why fight for Florida when they might be able to get it through diplomacy? So, the stage was set for a high-stakes negotiation. On one side, we have John Quincy Adams, the brilliant but often prickly U.S. Secretary of State. Adams was known for his sharp intellect and unwavering dedication to American interests. On the other side is Luis de Onís, the Spanish minister plenipotentiary. Onís was a seasoned diplomat with a reputation for being tough and cunning. The negotiations officially began in 1818, but don't let that fool you. Adams and Onís had been circling each other for years, each waiting for the perfect moment to make their move. But why 1818? What changed to finally bring these two to the negotiating table? Well, two major events shook things up. First, there was the invasion of Florida by none other than Andrew Jackson. Yes, that is Andrew Jackson, the future president. In 1818, Jackson was a general tasked with securing the Georgia-Florida border against Seminole attacks. But Jackson, being Jackson, decided to take things a step further. He marched right into Florida, captured Spanish forts, and even executed 2 British subjects accused of aiding the Seminoles. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of condemning Jackson's actions, President James Monroe decided to support them. This sent a clear message to Spain. If you can't control Florida, we will. The second game changer happened across the Atlantic. Spain had been hoping for support from other European powers to help regain control of its rebellious American colonies. But at the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1818, those hopes were dashed. Europe made it clear that Spain would have to manage its challenges alone, with no additional support forthcoming. With these developments, both sides realized it was time to deal. Spain feared losing Florida by force, while the U.S. saw an opportunity to gain it through diplomacy. As negotiations began earnestly, Adams and Onís engaged in a delicate diplomatic dance. Adams pushed hard for Florida, arguing that Spain could barely control the territory. Onís, meanwhile, tried to extract as many concessions as possible in return. Both sides were under pressure, as Adams knew securing Florida and a favorable western boundary would be a huge win for the United States. Onís, on the other hand, was trying to make the best of a bad situation for Spain. After months of negotiations, a breakthrough came on February 22, 1819, when Adams and Onís signed the Treaty of 1819, also known as the Adams-Onís Treaty, or the Transcontinental Treaty. This landmark agreement reshaped the map of North America with several key provisions. Spain ceded all of Florida, including East and West Florida, to the United States, giving the U.S. control of the entire peninsula and a strategic foothold on the Gulf of Mexico. The treaty established a clear border between U.S. and Spain territories from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean, starting at the mouth of the Sabine River, now the Texas-Louisiana border, running north to the Red River, then along the 42nd parallel to the Pacific. Spain relinquished claims to the Pacific Northwest above the 42nd parallel, opening the door for U.S. expansion to the Pacific. The U.S. gave up its claims to Texas, which remained part of Spanish territory, later Mexico, a strategic move for long-term gains. Lastly, the U.S. government agreed to take on $5 million in claims owed by Spain to U.S. citizens, allowing Spain to save face while giving the U.S. more leverage in the deal. But the story doesn't end there. After the treaty was signed, both governments still had to ratify it, and this is where things got a bit complicated. On the U.S. side, things went smoothly at first. Just 2 days after it was signed, the Senate unanimously ratified the treaty. But then, everything ground to a halt. Why? Because Spain was dragging its feet. King Ferdinand VII of Spain was having second thoughts. He hoped to use the treaty as leverage to get the United States to promise not to recognize the independence of Spain's rebelling American colonies. This delay put the U.S. in a tricky position. Some politicians, like the fiery Henry Clay, started arguing that the U.S. should take Florida by force and forget about the treaty. But John Quincy Adams, ever the strategist, counseled patience. He believed that Spain would eventually come around, and he didn't want to risk losing the favorable terms of the treaty. Meanwhile, in Spain, things were getting messy. King Ferdinand was facing pressure from all sides. The turning point came in 1820 when a group of Spanish army officers, fed up with being sent to fight losing battles in the Americas, staged a rebellion. This forced Ferdinand to accept a new constitution and give more power to the Spanish legislature. And guess what? In October 1820, Spain ratified the treaty. Because of the long delay, the U.S. Senate had to ratify the treaty again. This time, there was some opposition. Henry Clay and others argued that the U.S. should demand Texas as well. But in the end, the treaty passed the Senate again in February 1821. On February 22, 1821, exactly 2 years after it was first signed, the Adams-Onís Treaty officially became effective. In his diary, John Quincy Adams called it perhaps the most important day of my life. He recognized that the full significance of the treaty might not be apparent for years to come. And remember, in international relations, nothing is ever truly free. The Adams-Onís Treaty may have given the U.S. Florida without a direct payment, but its consequences shaped the destiny of nations for generations to come.